Thank you. Welcome. I am Dr. Mehnaz Afridi, the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. I'm also assistant professor of religious studies, and I really welcome you all here tonight. I'm very happy that we still have our cell phones on. Could you please turn those off? So, need I remind you, please turn your cell phones off. Thank you. In respect of a very special lecture and event tonight centered on Kristallnacht. I want to begin by saying Assalamu alaikum, shalom, and may peace be upon you. As I reflected on how to open up tonight on Kristallnacht and also on Dr. Frederick Schweitzer's conception of the center, as well as Dr. Marion Kaplan's accomplishments, I could not but think of the many tragic events that have occurred since the Holocaust, especially the list of genocides and war. Today, perhaps we are still in shock from the bombs and attacks in Beirut, Iraq, and Paris. We are in fear. We live in an uncertain time with labeled enemies that honestly we cannot define. The debates on Islam, radical Islam, extremism, Islamicism ring deeply with me as a Muslim. How does the world think of the other? How does the world think of Muslims? Who are these people destroying the name of Islam? I actually ask these questions every day, every moment perhaps, because of the work I do. Islam to me is a religion that teaches peace, but some violent, and perhaps too many Muslims have created a different vision and impetus for their own ideological means. Even though we shudder at the term Muslim for these extremists, it is us, Muslims, that must take the responsibility of defeating the acts of violence in our respected countries, in Paris, in London, in Madrid, in New York, and everywhere. This disturbing time, honestly for me, is a confusing one that perhaps begs us to focus on self-reflection, self-critique, and to encourage one another to support other faiths, races, and nationalities in this world and upon this very campus. We must, and I encourage you, that we must talk to one another, support one another, and include all faiths so that we do not have another cycle of violence that targets one people, one color, one gender, and one nation. I cannot forget the morning of 9/11, which most of you don't remember, that changed many things for Muslims. And again, Paris, that will be engraved in our minds for a long time. What can we do in the face of fear, loss, and confusion, I ask? How can we talk about these traumas and loss of life without creating an other to hate? As tonight we remember Kristallnacht, we should also think of the thousands of Jewish refugees during the 1930s that tried to immigrate to our borders and were refused. Most of these Jewish immigrants were murdered. Some escaped, and some sent to concentration camps. Today, our refugee crisis is of 7 million Syrian refugees, of which 3 million have been taken by Muslim and Arab countries. The chance of 1 of a million that might infiltrate us is hardly a way to stop violence and give a place of refuge to human beings. This is why this night, in commemoration of Kristallnacht, is so very important. And we cannot forget the terrible beginnings of Kristallnacht and what this night led to, and how bystanders let this event occur. And now we reflect on the courage of some and the loss of millions with shattered lives tonight. Kristallnacht, for those of you who don't know, owes its name to the shards of shattered glass that lined German streets in the wake of the pogrom. Broken glass from the windows of synagogues, homes, and Jewish-owned businesses plundered and destroyed during the violence. How did this night begin? The assassination of Ernst von Rath. The violence was instigated primarily by the Nazi Party officials and members of the SA and Hitler Youth. In its aftermath, German officials announced that Kristallnacht had erupted as a spontaneous outburst of public sentiment in response to the assassination of Ernst von Rath. Von Rath was a German embassy official stationed in Paris. Herschel Greenspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew, had shot the diplomat on November 7, 1938. A few days earlier, German authorities had expelled thousands of Jews of Polish citizenship living in Germany from the Reich. Greenspan had received news that his parents' residents in Germany since 1911 were among them. Greenspan's parents and other expelled Polish Jews were initially denied entry into their own native Poland. They found themselves stranded in a refugee camp near the town of Basin in the border region between Poland and Germany. Already living illegally in Paris himself, a desperate Greenspan apparently sought revenge for his family's precarious circumstances by appearing at the German embassy and shooting the diplomatic official assigned to assist him. Von Rath died on November 9th, 1938, 2 days after the shooting. The day happened to coincide with the anniversary of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, an important date in the National Socialist calendar. The Nazi Party leadership assembled in Munich for the commemoration. This night is not so different from today. This story is not that different. It may look black and white to you young people, but this story reoccurs over and over again. Tonight's lecture, and every year, we dedicate it to the founder of the center, Dr. Frederick M. Schweitzer, history professor emeritus, who was also the founder of the center in 1996, which was then called the Holocaust Resource Center. Dr. Schweitzer was also interested in the constructions of the other and the way in which society created mythological stereotypes of one another. His work has focused on the history of anti-Semitism in general, but he also has discussed how anti-Semitism began to rise in the Arab and Islamic context. Dr. Schweitzer's work carries with it a weight and historical analysis that is difficult to find. He works tirelessly on issues of anti-Semitism, memoirs, cutting-edge identities of prominent British Conservative Party leaders like Benjamin Disraeli, who remains to be the only prime minister who was Jewish by birth. Dr. Schweitzer has also recently finished the essay, Anti-Semitism and Law, which deals with international agreements, national legal systems that seek to contain and punish anti-Semitism. It is a part of a collection of essays edited by Stephen Baum, Anti-Semitism in North America, to be published by Brill later this year or early 2016. Without Dr. Schweitzer, we would not be here, nor would there have been a center. The center, a brief history in the 1960s, after the Vatican II document Nostra Aetate, the New York Diocese and Anti-Defamation League planned to work together to improve Catholic-Jewish relations. The Archbishop requested Manhattan College prepare for him a 60-page summary about Judaism. And of course, Dr. Schweitzer was assigned this task. The 60 pages became 300-page book, and a professor found his life's work. Dr. Schweitzer's study of Judaism, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust led to 4 books. The Manhattan College Holocaust Resource Center grew out of discussions between concerned faculty and administrations at the college, led by Rose Santos Cunningham, Brother Peter Drake, and Frederick Schweitzer, and members of the Riverdale community, and most notably Martin Spett, Lou Falkenstein, and late Martin Richmond during the 1995-96 academic year. The center's charter was approved by President of the college, Brother Thomas Scanlon, in 1996. I am seriously very pleased that we have a center like this and its expansion into interfaith education. That we can discuss these crucial issues, these very challenging and sensitive issues openly at the center, but also on this campus. Before I introduce our highlight for tonight, I would like to remember and commemorate Kristallnacht and victims of genocides all over the world. And I would ask first our honored guest, Freddie Seidel, to light a candle, followed by 11 of our students. 12 candles will be lit tonight. 6 million marking the Jews that were murdered, and 5 for the other victims during the Holocaust, and the last candle for those victims, and I encourage you to come here and write their names and put in the basket, that have lost their lives because of an atrocity. Ready? Armenia, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Holocaust. Thank you. I'm pleased to now introduce Dr. Marion Kaplan, who is also our distinguished lectureship program in association with American Jewish Studies, who comes here to us not from very far, but NYU, a long subway trip. Dr. Kaplan received her PhD in modern European history from Columbia University. She has taught at the City University of New York, as well as at NYU. In 2012, she won a Golden Dozen Award for teaching from the College of Arts and Sciences. Her courses include Modern European Jewish History, European Women's and Jewish Women's History, the German Racial State, Memoirs and Diaries in European Jewish History, and the 19th and 20th century German history. Her post-war Germany course focuses not only on history, but also on memory and memorialization. Kaplan's research concentrates on Jewish women's history and the history of Jewish daily life in Germany. Her publications are based on archival sources, but also on ego documents, such as diaries, letters, memoirs, that express feelings and personal perspectives along with the crucial details of daily life. Among some of her publications, I will mention that she is also the 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner for The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Woman, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, and Gender and Jewish History, as well as a finalist for Dominican Haven, the Jewish refugee settlement in Susa. She has edited books on German Jewish history, European women's history. She's an amazing scholar. I hope we will be friends after this night tonight, and I welcome her with my deep gratitude, and we are honored.
Thank you for such a nice introduction. I teach at NYU, but I actually stopped at home, which was near Columbia, so it wasn't even that far. From 1933 until Kristallnacht, Jews suffered boycotts, anti-Semitic legislation, which cost many of them their jobs and educations, and what the Nazis called Aryanization, I put that in quotes, which is really their property was stolen by the government. And what happened then was the basic, the basic decline of Jewish middle class status. But they didn't decline to sort of proletarian working class status because they weren't allowed to work anymore. So they basically came into pauperization. They also suffered social ostracism, but rarely until November 1938 did they suffer overt violence. The November pogrom was launched by the Nazis, as Menaz already said, as a result of the murder of a German diplomat in Paris. But frankly, I always have thought of that as an excuse. I never believed that that was the only that was the real reason they were planning something like this anyway. But the Nazis used the death of von Rath as this convenient excuse. While it was happening, the Nazis referred to it with typically bureaucratic euphemism as the Jew action. Afterwards, it became known as Kristallnacht or Reichskristallnacht or Kristallnacht. Most recently, people referred to it as the November pogrom. It was a pogrom in the sense of the old Russian pogroms, state-inspired, and then the mobs just went at it. So organized by the government and supported by local mobs, the attacks ranged from assailants wielding hatchets and axes to destroy Jewish homes and businesses to groups using incendiary bombs and dynamite to destroy synagogues. Mobs plundered Jewish property. The Nazis also invaded Jewish hospitals, old age homes, and orphanages. Finally, they systematically rounded up about 30,000 Jewish men and imprisoned them in concentration camps. There, brutality, humiliation, and outright murder reigned. The pogrom claimed the lives of at least 100 Jews, not including the deaths or suicides that occurred as indirect results of the pogrom. Moreover, the men who were lucky enough to come home from internment, quote, with shaved heads, unrecognizably dirty, and with frozen limbs, end quote, were often physically and psychologically ravaged. The pogrom also destroyed hundreds of synagogues and countless homes and shops. One of the lasting images of this pogrom is that of Kristall, the broken glass scattered around the streets the next day. A powerful If more mundane image mentioned often in Jewish women's memoirs is that of flying feathers. Feathers covering the internal space of the home, hallway, and front yard or courtyard. Similar to pogroms in Russia at the turn of the century, the marauders tore up goose feather blankets and pillows, shaking them into the rooms, out the windows, down the stairs. Jews were thus bereft of their bedding, and with that, the kind of physical and psychological security and comfort that this represented and that they had once known at home. So broken glass in public and strewn feather beds in private spelled the end of Jewish security in Germany. Now, the image of feathers flying is one of a domestic scene gravely disturbed. This was women's primary experience of the pogrom. The marauders beat and arrested men. There were exceptions. Some women were publicly humiliated, bloodied, beaten, and also murdered. Nonetheless, most women were forced to stand by and watch their homes torn apart and their men abused. Later, they were to anguish as the men disappeared into camps and then tried desperately to have them released, for the most part by struggling to acquire emigration papers. Rescuing their men was the most crucial task in the days following the pogrom. Wives, mothers, and daughters of prisoners were told that their men would be released only if they could present emigration papers. Women summoned the courage to overcome gender stereotypes of passivity in order to find any means to have the men freed from camps. One woman, whose husband was hiding, teamed up with a friend whose husband had been taken to the Camp Dachau, which was outside of Munich. Quote, "We ran from early morning to late evening. Nothing mattered anymore except to save your family and yourself." Another woman wrote of the November pogrom, quote, "From this hour on, I tried untiringly day in and out to find a connection that would lead to my husband's release. I ran to Christian acquaintances, friends, and colleagues, but everywhere people shrugged their shoulders and shook their heads and said no, and everyone was glad when I left. I was treated like a leper even by people who were positively inclined toward us." Undaunted, Steinpick entered Nazi headquarters in Munich, the notorious Brown House, to request her husband's release based on his status as a war veteran. There she was shown her husband 20 pounds thinner and begged repeatedly for his release. Eventually, it was granted. Another woman, Ruth Abraham, impressed her family, but also the SS with her determination. During the November pogrom, it was she who pulled her fiancé out of his store and led him through the crowded streets. She then traveled to Dachau to ask for the release of her future father-in-law. Arriving at the concentration camp in a bus filled with SS men, these were Hitler's elite troops, she was deposited inside the camp where she was ignored. She assumed that because of her, quote, Aryan looks, her blonde hair and blue eyes, she was taken for a member of the League of German Girls. Finally, she requested an interview with the commandant and begged for the release of her elderly father-in-law. She succeeded, again attributing her success to her looks, since the men who helped her refused to believe that she was really a Jew and seemed to take pity on her. Abraham's highly unconventional behavior found a more conventional reward. The couple married immediately. The rabbi who performed the ceremony did so with bandaged hands, an indication of the treatment he had received in a concentration camp. Some women not only arranged the release of loved ones, but also sold property and made all emigration decisions. Accompanying her husband home after his ordeal in a camp, one wife announced that she had just sold their house and bought tickets, of all places, to Shanghai for the whole family. Her husband reflected, quote, "Anything was okay with me, only not to stay in a land in which everyone had declared open season on us." Edith Bick recalled in an interview in 1972, quote, "When my husband was in a concentration camp, whatever there was, I had to take over, which I had never done before. Never. He didn't like it, but he not only accepted it, he was grateful." One prominent male lawyer rescued by his wife wrote about the November pogrom, quote, "Our wives worked tirelessly to obtain our release. Women thought nothing of going to authorities we normally did not approach without a good deal of trepidation. And I should add that when Jewish men went to the authorities, they could, in fact, have been arrested permanently, or they could have been beaten up. Whereas when women went, the assumption was the Nazis would not break gender roles, which they didn't at first. Similar expressions of thankfulness, tinged perhaps with a bit of surprise at women's heroism, can be found in many men's memoirs. They continued to be indebted to women even after their ordeal, when many men were too beaten in body and spirit to be of much use in the scramble to emigrate. Once the Nazis began releasing some men from these camps, women organized emergency assistance near the concentration camps. At the Weimar train station, for example, a group of Jewish women waited for men freed from Buchenwald. They gave them coffee, fresh socks, and handkerchiefs, and tried to clean their clothing a bit before sending them on trains to their various destinations. But not all Jewish men were that lucky. Quote, on a daily basis, one heard that the ashes of a dead person had been delivered to this or that family. These urns were sent COD, cash on delivery, for which the post office took the sum of 3.75 marks. It is striking that in the testimony of both men and women, women's calm, dry-eyed self-control in the midst of turmoil is emphasized. For example, a Jewish community leader, a man, wrote, the highest praise during these days goes to our wives who, without shedding one tear, inspired the hordes, some of whom had beaten their men bloody, to respect them. Unbroken, these women did everything to have their men freed as soon as it was possible. Charlotte Stein-Pick recalled her husband's counsel on the day of the pogrom. He had sort of whispered to her as the police were coming, as the Gestapo was coming, just no tears and no scene. But she writes, even without this warning, I would have controlled myself. Another woman, remembering the pain of being forced to hand over prized family heirlooms to the Nazis some months after the pogrom, reflected on the dignity and self-control of Jews around her and on her own form of defiance. Quote, I was glad that the Jews I saw didn't show how upset they were. During an onerous government inspection of the property with which she hoped to emigrate in 1939, she recalled, quote, they asked a lot of questions to confuse us, but I just darned my socks and acted very quietly. When the Nazis confiscated all of her valuable ritual objects and jewelry, a Hamburg woman wrote a poem to express both her sadness and her quiet defiance. Despite her grief, she ended with, quote, I will separate myself without tears. Jewish women sustained their dignity by remembering who they really were, not who their enemies said they were. This desire to appear calm was not merely a proclamation of female stalwartness to counter the stereotype of female fragility. Emphasis on composure also resulted from the decorum stressed in Jewish bourgeois upbringing. It asserted Jewish pride in the face of what they thought of as Aryan savagery, bourgeois comportment in the face of the rabble, human dignity in the face of barbarism. But women's perseverance is also more than the sum of these parts, suggesting a new role for women. Traditionally, men had publicly guarded the honor of the family and community. Now, suddenly, Jewish women found themselves in the difficult position of defending Jewish honor. Outward calm notwithstanding, women's inner stress was massive as they faced the dizzying procedure of obtaining proof of immediate plans to emigrate in order to free a relative from a concentration camp. The red tape involved in emigrating was excruciating, as will be seen shortly. But first, a few words on earlier Jewish emigration. First, I'd like to talk about the desire to emigrate. From the early years of the Nazi regime onward, it was overwhelmingly women who urged men to flee Germany. This reflects their gender-specific, distinctive connection to the public world. Jewish men thought they had, and did have, a great deal more to lose. They had to tear themselves away from their life work, whether a business or professional practice, whether patients or clients or colleagues, status or possessions. As long as they made a living, many breadwinners were unwilling to face uncertainty and poverty abroad, even when wives were willing to do so. In light of men's primary identification with their occupation and with their breadwinner status, they often felt trapped into staying. Women, whose identity was more family-oriented, struggled to preserve what was central to them by fleeing with it. Moreover, men and women often assessed the dangers differently, reflecting their different contacts and frames of reference. Women noticed their neighbors, listened to the domestic help, and observed their children. Men paid attention to politics and business. Still, decisions seem to have been made by husbands, or, after the pogrom, by circumstances. The November pogrom decisively tipped the balance toward emigration. For those in camps, as I've said before, the only way out was proof that you were ready to emigrate. And for those not in camps, the violence influenced their decision. After November 1938, essentially everyone tried to find a possibility of emigrating. Now, it's common from hindsight to criticize German Jews for not having emigrated quickly enough and hoping that they could still remain in Germany, or for loving Germany too much, or for not seeing the writing that was clearly on the wall. This is a serious distortion. In the 1930s, Nazi deception helped to mislead and confuse German Jews, allowing them to maintain some hope. I should add, it confused Germans too. Moreover, although many German Jews did love Germany and did not want to leave, many could not leave. They were elderly, or had elderly parents to care for, or hesitated to leave property behind in Germany and arrive penniless in a new land, especially during the worldwide depression. After the pogrom, those Jews who remained tried desperately to get out to anywhere: Latin America, Haiti, Cuba, Australia, even the Dominican Republic and Shanghai. But as we know, perceptions by Jews of their predicament, either before or after 38, were never the crucial factors affecting emigration. Closed doors around the world impeded escape. And that's where I think Menaz's comment came in before too, which is refugees faced closed doors. And lest you think that the Jewish refugees in any way were somewhat different from the Syrian refugees, the Americans thought that with all these Jewish refugees, Nazis would also come in with them. So the same argument we hear today, which is, oh, well, but there'll be terrorists coming in, which may very well be true. There may be a few terrorists. And there probably were a few Nazis who came in as well. But that was the argument against refugees, was that they would have the word was fifth columnists. Those of you who are American historians have heard that term. The fifth columnists would be coming in with the refugees. A brief review of Nazi emigration policies offers a backdrop for the frenzied activity of the post-pogrom period. The chief objective of Nazi policy toward the Jews between 1935 and September 1939 had been to foster emigration. Jews, however, had to confront a bewildering array of countries, requirements, and details, and profound obstacles to emigration, as I said, existed during the Depression. In addition, countries with open doors needed farmers, not middle-class professionals and business people. Also, the German Jewish age distribution limited emigration, since German Jews were disproportionately middle-aged or elderly. Importantly, the government's restriction on the amount of money and property Jews could take with them were major obstacles to emigration. It became harder and harder to leave because new laws every few months robbed Jews of the means to start a life somewhere else. Finally, with the war, the Nazis set further roadblocks before Jews hoping to escape, and emigration was officially prohibited in October 1941. And that is the same month that transports started deporting Jews from Germany eastward. So the same month they finally closed the doors. Despite all obstacles, Jewish emigration was far from negligible. Before 1938, about a quarter of Germany's 525,000 Jews left. The largest number to leave in 1 year emigrated directly after the pogrom, reaching 78,000 in 1939. It's reasonable to estimate that between 270,000 and 300,000 Jews emigrated. That is close to 3/5 of German Jews managed to flee Germany, though not all to safety. About 30,000 were also caught by the Nazis in other European countries. They went to Holland and they went to France, etc., Italy. Ultimately, about half of those Jews who had lived in Germany in 1933 could save themselves through emigration to safer countries. Now, statistics give the impression that a certain number of Jews smoothly managed to leave Germany. They cover up the individual stories which describe complicated emigration attempts, failures, and new attempts. Gallo's humor makes the point. If one studied Spanish or Portuguese to go to Latin America, suddenly barriers to entry arose, and one had to prepare for another country. If one turned to Hebrew, obstacles to acquiring the necessary certificates were certain to develop, and one had to change to another language. Thus, a joke made the rounds of one town. The question was, what language are you learning? The answer, the wrong one, of course. After the pogrom, the situation was critical. Elizabeth Freund described her and her husband's many attempts to leave. And I'm going to read, this is a longish quote, but it gives you a sense of what is happening in this period. She writes, "It's really enough to drive one to despair. We've already done so many things to get out of here. We've filed applications for entry permits to Switzerland, Denmark, and Sweden, all in vain, though in these countries we actually had good connections. In the spring of '39, from an agent, we obtained an entry permit for Mexico. But we never received the visa because the Mexican consulate asked us to present passports that would let us come back to Germany, and the Germans refused to do that. Then in August '39, we did actually get the permit for England, but it came too late, only 10 days before the war. And in this short time, we were not able to take care of all the formalities with the German authorities. In the spring of 1940, we received the entry permit for Portugal. We immediately got everything ready and applied for our passports. Then came the invasion of Holland, Belgium, and France by the Germans. A stream of refugees poured into Portugal, and the Portuguese government recalled by wire all of the permits. It was also good that in December 1940 we had not already paid for our Panamanian visas, for we noticed that the visas offered us did not at all entitle us to land in Panama. Freund reflected on friends who urged her to leave Germany, quote, as if that weren't our most fervent wish. People in and out of Germany failed to comprehend that the Freunds, like so many others, desperately wanted to get out, but the opportunities didn't exist. Once the lucky ones received the sought-after permission to enter a foreign country, Jews still had to acquire myriad papers to exit Germany. Organizing these papers took months of running a bureaucratic gauntlet, which many women faced alone, either because husbands were imprisoned or because they assumed the Nazis would not arrest the women. They met officials who arbitrarily added to the red tape. Bella Fromm's diary from 1938 summarized the plight of all German Jews. Quote, so far I've gathered a collection of 23 of the necessary documents. I've made a thorough study of the employees and furniture in 15 official bureaus. Bewildered, she added, she still did not have all the papers she needed. By 1939, new arbitrary laws slowed emigration even more. Even with a United States affidavit in hand, and that was the piece of paper you needed in order to get into the States, it was called an affidavit. Even with that affidavit in hand, one woman could not simply leave because she needed to sell her furniture and pay a new tax on people who were leaving the country. And she needed to sell everything she had in order to pay that tax, and that took time. Jews also faced plunder by individual corrupt bureaucrats. Gestapo agents, civil servants, packers, even individuals in foreign consulates demanded bribes and tributes of every sort. One woman, desperate to get her husband out of a camp and expecting to receive their visas from the American consulate imminently, was shocked to learn there were Germans at the consulate who expected bribes in order to forward her papers in the American consulate. She went to a lawyer who informed her it would take 3,000 marks to pay off the swindlers. Quote, I ran around bewildered. In spite of everything, we German Jews still continued to resist believing the terrible corruption which National Socialism had brought with it. But these bourgeois housewives quickly learned to bribe those whose help they so desperately needed. Individual avarice wasn't the worst of it. The plunder of Jewish property was part and parcel of all emigration proceedings. The tax I just mentioned threatened to impoverish prospective emigrants. It was called the Reichsflight tax. The German treasury may have gained as much as 900 million marks from that alone. Many people had to sell all of their belongings simply to get to pay that tax. After the pogrom, the Gestapo, which is the secret police, in Berlin set up a special one-stop emigration bureau where, to quote one of the Jewish leaders, emigrating Jews were, quote, fleeced totally and completely in the manner of an assembly line. When they entered, they were still a German citizen, the owner of an apartment or a business or a bank account or some savings. By the time they got to the other end of the hall and left, they had been reduced to stateless beggars, grasping one precious possession, an exit visa. When Jews packed, they believed that their departure would be permanent. With few exceptions, women took charge of the packing. This was so clearly considered women's work that some women actually stayed behind to do the packing. And of course, the issue was to get the men out as fast as possible or they could be rearrested, so they had to get them out. Packing was not only a necessity, it quickly became an art as Nazi rulings and red tape turned the process into a nightmare. In order to emigrate with one's belongings, the finance department had to issue a permit. The permit was obtainable only after lists of all the items Jews wished to take with them had been handed in. One woman spent an entire week writing, quote, endless lists in 5 copies each, every item entered, every list neatly typed, and in the end, I could only speak and breathe and think in shoes, towels, scissors, soap, and scarves. And this is, of course, well before computers. And so she had to type all the lists out. After completing the lists, and often with ship or plane tickets in hand, Jews had to wait for the authorization of the finance department. Despite official policy encouraging emigration, the Nazi bureaucracy actually dawdled and delayed emigration. Again, connections and bribes seemed to speed up the process, and again, women without much previous experience in the world of officialdom had to master the art of bribing. Few people could pack all of their belongings. The giant containers and the surcharge demanded by the Nazis for every item cost too much. Those who could afford even one container still had to sell most of their belongings. Most could not afford even that. Most emigrants could not afford such costly things and traveled to foreign lands with only a few suitcases, wrote one social worker. Many emigrants, both the wealthy and poorer, tried to sell their homes and furnishings for a pittance. Dismantling her home after the November pogrom, Alice Beerwald wrote, quote, it was so terribly difficult to destroy oneself what one had created with so much love. The city of Danzig decided the price of her house and chose the buyer. She then sold the contents of her home. The purchasers were Aryans, many complaining of their plight. Since Nazi ideology insisted that the Germans suffered because of the Jews, many Germans could complain of their lot, exploit Jews, and ignore Jewish suffering all at the same time. A pastor's wife proclaimed to Alice, quote, we're suffering just as much as you are. But Beerwald retorted, only with the difference that you're buying and I'm selling. It was clear to the emigrants that their German neighbors were benefiting greatly from their misery, and doubtlessly clear to some Germans as well. Placing an ad in the paper among other ads by Jews, Lottie Popper commented, quote, yes, the Aryans had it good. They could now beautify their homes on the cheap with the well-cared-for furniture of emigrating Jews. Being women's work, packing gave some women the opportunity to smuggle valuables out of the country. What they managed to salvage with ingenuity and shrewdness was paltry in comparison with what the Nazis had stolen from them. Still, it helped some families subsist for a short time and saved precious mementos for others. While most women packed feverishly under the gaze of 1 or 2 officials, some women managed to bribe those officials who came to their home. Smuggling jewelry into her bags, one woman commented on the official who demanded huge payoffs to make this possible. Quote, this corruption of the Germans, which grew into the monstrous, rescued the lives and a modest existence for many people. While for many, packing reduced a lifetime of possessions into 3 suitcases, for others, the clothing, shoes, and linens that they packed had been donated by the Jewish Winter Relief Agency. Having sold the little they had to pay for their voyage, they had nothing left to take with them. Now, who stayed behind? A gender analysis of the desire to emigrate highlighted women's unique expectations, priorities, and perceptions. It doesn't follow, however, that more women than men actually left. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. So why is this so? There were still compelling reasons to stay. First, women, especially young women, could still find jobs as teachers in Jewish schools or in Jewish social services. As the Nazis kicked Jews out of the German social services, Jewish organizations, with the help of American Jewish money from the Joint Distribution Committee, were able to build up social service agencies and schools and old age homes especially. And young women found jobs there. Dr. Martha Wertheimer, for example, worked as a journalist before 1933. Afterwards, she plunged into Jewish welfare. She escorted children's transports to England, worked 12-hour days without pausing for meals in order to advise Jews on emigration and welfare, and organized continuing education courses for Jewish youth who had been drafted into forced labor. Ultimately, she wrote a friend in New York that, quote, "It is also worthwhile to be an officer on the sinking ship of Jewish life in Germany, to hold out courageously and to fill the lifeboats to the extent that we have some." She did not wait to emigrate, and she was murdered. While the employment situation of Jewish women helped keep them in Germany, that of men helped get them out. Some husbands or sons had business connections abroad, facilitating their immediate flight, and others emigrated alone in order to establish themselves and then send for their families. Also, families believed that sons needed to establish economic futures for themselves, whereas daughters would presumably marry. Despite trepidations, parents sent sons into the unknown more readily than daughters. Another reason why more women remained behind was the fact that before the war, and I've already said this, men faced more immediate physical damage and danger than women, and were forced to flee promptly after the November pogrom. So, in a strange twist of fortune, the men interred in concentration camps were released only upon showing proof of their ability to leave Germany right away. Families, mostly wives and mothers, strained every resource to provide the documentation to free these men and send them on their way, while some of the women remained behind. One woman wrote about this decision. She recalled how difficult the decision was for all Jews. Should we send the men out first? This had been the dilemma all along in our work. If you have 2 tickets, do you take one man out of a concentration camp and his wife, who is at this moment safe? Or do you take 2 men out of the camp? They took 2 men out because they said, we cannot play God, but these people are in immediate danger and they have to go out. Even as women feared for their men, they believed that women would be spared serious harm by the Nazis. Johanna Meyer's grandmother, for example, simply said, she refused to become a burden on her children abroad and simply said, "No one will hurt me, an old woman." Further, as more and more sons left, daughters remained as the sole caretakers for elderly parents. One female commentator noted the presence of a whole slew of women, quote, who cannot think of emigration because they don't know who might care for their elderly mother in the interim before they could start sending money. In the same families, the sons went their way. In fact, leaving one's aging parent, and as statistics indicate, this was usually the widowed mother, was the most painful act imaginable. Ruth Glaser described her mother's agony as her mother realized she had to join Ruth's father, who had been forbidden re-entry into Germany. Quote, "She couldn't sleep at night thinking of leaving her mother behind." As early as 1936, the League of Jewish Women saw cause for serious concern regarding, quote, "the problem of the emigration of women, which is often overlooked and not understood," end quote. Not only did the League realize that far fewer women than men were leaving, but it turned toward parents, reminding them of, quote, their responsibility to free their daughters, too. As late as January 1938, the Hilfsverein, one of the main emigration organizations, announced, quote, "Up to now, Jewish emigration indicates a severe surplus of men. Blaming this on the, quote, nature of women to feel closer to family and home and on that of men toward greater adventurousness, the Hilfsverein suggested that couples marry before emigrating, encouraged women to prepare themselves as household helpers, and promised that women's emigration would become a priority. Yet only 2 months later, the Hilfsverein announced it would expedite the emigration only of those women who could prove a minimum of competence in household skills. In general, fewer women than men received support from Jewish organizations in order to emigrate. Young women and their families were often also reluctant to consider Palestine and the kibbutz as an alternative for daughters. Statistics for the first half of 1937, for example, show that only a third of young people who were taking advantage of Zionist retraining programs were girls. There was also discrepancy among children who went to Palestine under the auspices of Youth Aliyah, which was an organization that brought young people to Palestine. They required 60% boys and 40% girls. The growing disproportion of Jewish women in the German Jewish population also resulted from the fact that, to begin with, there were more Jewish women than men in Germany. Thus, in order to stay even, a greater absolute number of women would have had to emigrate. In 1933, 52% of Jews were women, resulting from such factors as male casualties during World War I, greater marrying out by males, greater conversion out of Judaism by males, and greater longevity of females. The slower rate of female than male emigration meant that the female proportion of the population rose to 58% by 1939. One woman wrote, in part, we women had been left to ourselves. Our husbands had died from shock, partly they'd been processed from life to death in a concentration camp, and partly wives, aware of the greater danger to their husbands, had prevailed upon them to leave at once. They were ready to take care of everything and to follow their husbands, but because of the war, that became impossible for many to realize, and quite a few of my friends and acquaintances became martyrs of Hitler. A large proportion of these remaining women were elderly. Since many of the young had emigrated, the number of aging Jews also increased proportionately, among them a large number of widows. In the wake of the November pogrom, many families fled, leaving their aging parents. In 1939, there were over 6,000 widowed Jewish men and over 28,000 widowed Jewish women in the expanded Reich. Thus, 20% more Jewish women than men, especially but not only the elderly, remained behind. When Elizabeth Freund, one of the last Jews to leave Germany legally in October 1941, went to the Gestapo for her final papers, she observed, quote, all old people, old women, waiting online. In conclusion, during and after the pogrom, Jewish women maintained an extraordinary degree of, at least outward, calm. They tried to cope by diverting themselves and by the sense of dignity they sustained, by remembering who they really were, not who their enemies said they were. Moreover, they toiled to clean up the debris and doggedly sought the release of their male relatives. Their homes no longer offered safety or security. Their men needed to be rescued, and they now knew with certainty that their lives in Germany faced qualitatively new hardships and cruelties. Most embarked on the dizzying chase from bureaucracy to free the men, pay bribes where necessary, and do everything in their limited power to find a haven abroad. As the Germans plundered their belongings, Jewish women tried to overcome the myriad obstacles to escape, facilitating the exodus of tens of thousands. Still, all German Jews were unable to save themselves, trapped by Nazi viciousness and by the unwillingness of countries of refugees to take them in. Caught in their obligations, their economic and social circumstances, the remaining German Jews faced the war and much worse. Thank you. Do you want to take questions? Sure.
Huh? Yes, I'll bring you some. Okay.
They have, that, a moving thing?
Yeah, they have a speaker
Maybe
in
you
here.
know.
We have Matt. Should be in here.
Oh, you've got the key.
So, those of you who have to leave, please leave. Those of you.
You don't have to leave.
You don't have to leave, but they're leaving.
Right.
So, we're
Stay
gonna take
late.
questions, and James will bring the mic around. And I'm gonna bring her some water.
Thank you.
Testing, testing.
Sounds good. Do you want to just take it around?
I'll do it, sure. You want
Oh,
me to
okay.
keep this one on?
Yeah, please.
All right, just flip the on switch whenever you're ready.
First, there's the first row, and then the second row, and then the first row in the back.
Oh, hang on.
I would just like to add one thing, I hope you don't mind. That at one point, the situation became so bad that the German government also required round-trip tickets, that people had to bring proof that
They were
the men that they were rescuing out of the concentration camps had a round-trip ticket out of Germany, just in case they wouldn't be accepted elsewhere, and the German government wouldn't have to pay for their return trip.
Thank you. Behind, in the back, and then,
Marion, we have relatives in Kiel by the Danish frontier. They went to Palestine and they returned. I don't think they were the only ones, but because of the circumstances, also there was a Polish immigration into Nazi Germany even afterwards. The situation calls it. But anyhow, my question is Kristallnacht wasn't just in Germany, it was Austria, and perhaps the Czech Republic, I'm not sure.
I don't know.
How did the situation differ in Austria?
Austria had something like a Kristallnacht in March 1938 already. When the Germans came into Austria, they were very, very violent toward Austrian Jews. But not they didn't burn down the synagogues or whatever, but they beat people in the streets. So the violence started. The violence against Jewish bodies started in Austria in March 38. And then there was a Kristallnacht as well.
Was it worse?
I wouldn't say worse or better. I really wouldn't. There's a young man in the back who
Yeah,
has.
before we continue, I know we're going to take questions from a student first.
Yeah, well, this young man in the back had his hand up. Yeah, looked like a student.
You said that one big reason for Jewish people not being accepted in America was the fear that there may be some Nazi people. To what extent do you think also the strong anti-Semitism feeling in the United States was also a big reason for not letting in Jews?
Absolutely. There's no question. I mean, if I want to go into the American response, first of all, it was the Depression. So Americans didn't want any people coming in because they would be competitors for jobs. Then there was very, very ardent anti-Semitism in the United States as well. And this fifth columnist argument was really much more a government argument. I don't know how many people actually bought into it, but the State Department was also always talking about fifth columnists. But I think the job situation and anti-Semitism were profoundly important. So that was a very good question. Other students? We're supposed to take students? Okay, there's a student back there. We'll get to you. Not
I
yet.
have a question about the beginning of your lecture. You talked about Kristallnacht and how it was mostly men were beat up by German men in the streets. But what about German women? Was it acceptable for them to beat up Jewish women? Or
No. The women were not doing that, but there were many incidents where Jewish women were also beaten by mobs, but the mobs were mostly men. But this is actually not well known, but I mean, I have gathered together maybe 2-3 dozen incidents like that. German women were not involved in that. But I was just showing my class today some street scenes of, the Nazis marching or of Jews being marched with their little suitcases to be deported, to be murdered. And there are people standing there, men and women, just standing in the street, looking. So it's, you know, they're there, but they're not part of the actual physical violence. That's not the way women were socialized. You had your hand up a long time, yes.
Hi, my name's Sam Goldman. I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. And I recently read some comments by Ian Kirshner and other historians of that period when Pogrom took place. And they mentioned that there were actually many Germans and other people in other countries in the area who were aghast at what happened on Kristallnacht. And I'm asking you to comment on the fact that nowadays so much similar items are occurring to Palestinians, and you find very, very few Jewish Americans, Israeli Jews, who are commenting on what's happening to their neighbors.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too much into contemporary politics, but you're right to say there were many Germans who were very, very upset by the physical destruction, the destruction of property. This is in the middle of a depression. And, you know, these mobs tore into houses and stores, and you can see pictures. Everything is devastated. So Germans were embarrassed by that and angry about that. And they're also, German society was very, praised itself for being orderly and praised itself for being not just efficient, but also careful about money, careful about waste. And so this was really horrible to them. And also, people were overheard saying, this is terrible, this is a sin against culture. Because you're also breaking down houses of God, right? So it was also that. So you did get that in Germany and elsewhere. I would say, without getting into the whole issue of Israel-Palestine, that you do find Jewish voices, particularly in places like Haaretz, which is an Israeli magazine, an Israeli newspaper, which is constantly criticizing the Israeli government for its terrible stances and its settlement policies. So I mean, there are voices, but they are very small voices. And I think what you have there is a situation where, you know, the peace groups have been somewhat isolated. The Jewish peace groups have been somewhat isolated. So that's all I want to say about, I'm a historian. I don't want to go anywhere else with that. Yeah, please. Hi.
Obviously, if you could tell by my doe eyes, I'm a novice to this information, but I just wanted to ask you, at what moment did you think to go into greater depth into the Jewish culture, specifically advocating for women in particular? And do you feel a certain connection to Islamic women who are facing the same issues today during this cultural debacle?
Okay, so the first part of that is, you may have doe eyes and feel this is new, but at my age will tell you that I was in the feminist movement in the 70s. So that's, we sort of can identify ourselves. So as a feminist, I was just, and I was always interested in history, and I was a German historian. So I became very interested in, like, where are the women? You know, what is this? And it didn't make sense to me that, and it was partly also, this was a period that when I went to Columbia, where social history was becoming very, it was a new idea. My professors were all diplomatic history or intellectual history, but social history. The history of how everybody lives, everyday life, was becoming more popular, and I was very interested in that. And then women's history sort of grew out of that too, and out of the feminist movement. I mean, I think without a feminist movement, we wouldn't have been as aware of women's issues. So that's the first part. The second part, again, is a contemporary problem, so I really want to limit that because I'm a historian. That's where I'm most comfortable. But I would say that I basically follow the debates among Muslim women. I don't take a stand. I follow the debates, I know some of the arguments, but I don't feel it's even my place to take a stand, so. And maybe you think that's wrong, but that's how I feel, so. Yeah, please.
I'd like to pick up on your comments about the reception of as witnesses to the pillage and the humiliation of the German population. The Nazi High Command took that very much into account.
Yeah.
And there are reports about that the action against the Jews was received very badly by the Germans. Not that they ceased to be anti-Semitic, far from it. And the lesson was, I think, we cannot have pogroms. This is Goebbels style. We're going to do it Himmler style, namely secret, scientific, clandestinely, and so forth. And rebut me, if you will, on the basis of your understanding. My sense is that the German regime, the Hitler regime, until Kristallnacht, wanted to solve the Jewish question by immigration.
Yeah, well, that's what most of the historians
They
argue.
failed.
Yeah.
And failing, they turned to another solution, which we are all too familiar.
Right. I mean, that's very much what historians think until probably, some people even think till 41.
Yes.
So.
While I was listening to you talk with the men, the women, the mothers, I was thinking of the children. It seems to me they probably suffered the most, the anguish, the fear. Do you have any?
Yeah, I actually have a whole chapter on children in my book on this subject. And the one thing I didn't say, which I think it may actually, if you think about the math, it becomes obvious. I said the elderly remain behind. What the German Jewish community did incredibly successfully was get out its young, so that about 80% of people under the age of 25 were able to leave. And that is to the Jewish community's credit. But of course, that makes the population then disproportionately elderly. Some of those children left with families. Others were sent ahead by their families or by the community, and others left on the children's transports, which started right after the November pogrom and were organized by the Quakers, the Joint Distribution Committee, the Jewish community in Germany and in Austria, in Vienna. So yeah, so the children got out, but of course, children had the worst time because children are mean to each other. So it's really, in schools they suffered, and the teachers were cruel to the Jewish kids and separated them and segregated them. And so even at the best places, which were Berlin, the best schools, Peter Gay writes about this in his memoir, it still was a very unpleasant atmosphere. So definitely the children had a terrible time of it. Yeah, you were trying for a long time.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I have a question about after immigration, and that's given the centrality to women and kind of assuming these new roles, was there a change in the gender dynamics after the war within these families? That's
such a good question. I don't have an answer for that. Because that gets us into 1950s America, 1950s Canada, 1950s England, and that was a very conservative era. And also, to Jewish women in Germany and Austria did not really work much outside the home. So about 18% of Jewish women worked outside the home, and about 31% of German non-Jewish women worked outside the home. During the Nazi period, when men lost their jobs, many, many Jewish women took on new jobs. So they were actually working. And I have a story of one woman, for example, who went to Switzerland and studied with Jung and became a psychoanalyst and got the family into England because they didn't need doctors, and her husband was a doctor. The English were not happy with doctors. It was just more competition. So, but they needed analyst, so got her in. And she would have never had that opportunity. You know, she would have been a wife. She would have not been able to do that. So for some, it was a real opportunity to do something else with their lives. But I don't know enough about the dynamics. And if my observations of the Washington Heights German Jewish community are any indication, I don't see much. The guy was always given the head of the table, and he was always given at least lip service. I don't know about how decisions were really made, but I come from that sort of background, so I certainly know many, many, many couples like that. Yeah. Hold it up. Thank you. Hold it up.
I was 8 years old. I slept through Kristallnacht. We were in that area that wasn't Jewish. In our class, there were 3 Jews and 1 Protestant. He was the real minority. I slept through. In the morning, one of the Jewish fathers from the school came and said, "Hide me." His name is Grünspan. You heard about Grünspan?
Yeah, the name.
So
Right.
he knew that he was in danger.
Oh. He was a relative?
No, he was a classmate, the father of a classmate. So my mother put him in the bathroom. About a half hour later, a relative from the Jewish court showed up, hiding. So she put him in the bathroom. Another half hour, 2 stormtroopers showed up. I don't know if this was foresight or good luck. She went to the door. The 2 stormtroopers wanted to search the apartment. She pulled out a letter from Buchenwald, where my father was. Said, "You got my husband, what else do you want?"
Huh.
They left. Both of those families got to America ahead of us.
Hmm.
At one point, my mother wanted to send me in the children's transport to Holland. I just refused. It was my best decision of the lifetime. You all know what happened to Anne Frank in Holland and the Jews of Holland. I've been there.
Right.
Eventually, we got out, and the others from who were in our room that day got there ahead of us to America.
Thank you.
I became a professor of computer science at the University of California. Oh, by the way, when they came to America, they changed their name from Grünspan to Gray.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much. I was listening to you talk, and I became very curious about the German policy and the German bureaucratic attitude as you were recounting what happened. And it's always known for having been effective and direct in accomplishing what it wants to do. But what you seem to describe had all sorts of cross-cutting motivations. If it was to get the Jews out of Germany,
But to slow them down.
and then they put down all of these objectives, and I thought, well, some of them were clearly to plunder them.
Mhm.
How do you explain or understand, or what is insight in what it was that caused the Germans to, screw it up so royally that they couldn't seem to figure out what it was, and the consequence was an even worse sense of helplessness on the part of the Jews that were the objects of this policy?
I think that what we see in hindsight is this sort of organized thing that leads to Auschwitz, right? That's what we see in hindsight. But when you see it up close, in 33, 36, 39, you see a lot of conflicting currents. Not even, first of all, because the government does not have a plan, okay? They do want them to emigrate, but they don't have a plan. And as soon as they go march into Austria, they get another 200,000 Jews. After they just got rid of maybe 150,000, now they got more. So they don't have a plan, number one. And number two, there are lots of competing organizations. So you have, what you were just talking about, the Goebbels organization, the Himmler organization. You have the police competing strongly with the Ministry of Justice. Ministry of Justice still has some old-fashioned idea of some judicial proceeding, as in law, and of course Himmler and the police don't. And so there's a lot of conflict going on. So I wouldn't see this as a completely orderly process, even though we have this stereotype of Germans as very organized, efficient. That's not the case. And I can give you many other examples of contradictions, many. Not always just with the Jewish case. So Hitler comes to power saying he wants to clean up the streets for prostitutes, and then he builds brothels all over. Excuse me. So there are many, many contradictions. Thank you for all your good questions.
Thank you so much. And if you would like to ask your questions as well, thank you again, everyone, for coming.
When I get in a footnote, it seems to me that they were dealing not with human beings, they were dealing with animals.
Right, subhumans.
And when you call someone a pig, you can do anything to that person, any kind of humiliation and degradation.
That's right. I think thank you, that's a good way of ending.
Let's give Marion a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful.
Thank
I
you.
have so much to learn from you.